So welcome everybody. This is just great. I want to thank the Hansen Foundation for funding this. I want to thank College of Arts and Letters for funding it, and I want to thank Mobilization for funding it as well. We have a distinguished panel together today, and I suppose we'll just start with that. Our first speaker today is Larry Isaac, and if you're a sociologist, you know who he is. His work has been very influential. It's a real honor that you're here with us today, Larry. Larry comes to us via first Florida State and then Vanderbilt, where he is a distinguished professor and chair there. He holds the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor of Sociology there. He's received numerous awards. Most significantly was this great article he had in ASR a few years ago that received several awards, not only from the labor section, but from the culture section. And it's quite a distinguishing honor there. He's published over 40 articles, numerous book chapters, and I'm just delighted that he honors us with his thoughts today about the centers where movement identity and activist identity develop. So please join with me in welcoming Larry Isaac.
I'm really honored to be here and to be the lead-off batter, so to speak. Puts a lot of pressure on you to get on base, as they say. I like to have a little bit of a preamble before I start these things, but I'm worried a little bit about time. I don't know how strict and disciplined Hank's going to be, but I got to assume it's going to be there. One thing I wanted to say right at the outset was that I probably would not be here talking to you today if it were not for a relationship that I developed very fortunately for me a few years back, and that was to become a close friend and a mentee, a student basically of one of the greatest tacticians of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, that's James M. Lawson Jr. And for about 6 years straight, I was fortunate to be connected to him through breakfast, lunches, and dinners, and worked hard to absorb as much as I could from this man's deep knowledge of the struggle that he was involved in and continues to be involved in. With that, I will move on and start with a few state of the literature claims, one of which is that over time it has struck me that the sociology of the civil rights movement is particularly strong on structure, but relatively weak on insurgent learning that's necessary for agentic kinds of processes. And I would count Sean, where Sean's somewhere in the audience, Sean Chavos' fine work on the traditional root, the transnational roots of the Southern civil rights movement as an exception. And as we move along, I think you'll see why. This neglect of the learning process that's so important in developing high-quality insurgents has manifested itself in the relative silence in ignorance or neglect of the nonviolent repertoire itself, and then it has a number of subdimensions which I've outlined here. And one is the very fact of neglecting the development of nonviolence as a modal strategy for the Southern Civil Rights Movement, not the only strategy. It actually comes out of a field of contention. So we as sociologists, I don't think, have paid much attention to that. There's a neglect on how nonviolence was practiced in direct response to violent repression, and there's also neglect, I think, of insurgent quality, which is a point that I tried to address with some colleagues in a recent paper published in Mobilization this past year. So my central questions today are basically these. How did nonviolent strategy emerge from a repertoire of other strategic contenders to become the modal strategy between the mid-50s and the mid-60s in the US? And how did movement agents adapt the strategy in concrete tactical form when they were faced with violent assault? And connected to that last question, did insurgent quality seem to matter in the process of adaptation? So my approach is to draw on several literatures. One is the sociology of movement strategy and tactics, and some key sources here that most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Draw from some literature on nonviolence and civil resistance studies, and also historical work on the diffusion of nonviolent practice in the long civil rights movement. Then I'm going to trace very quickly the strategic development, and this is probably a real error on my part, but strategic development of nonviolence in the civil rights movement to its modal position, and then do a little bit, I'll give you an example of how I'm analyzing these episodes, interaction episodes between violent repression and tactical adaptation by movement agents. So by strategic development, one of the big fancy terms in my title, I mean the often, at least in this movement, maybe not in all movements, but the often long-term struggle-filled process of learning associated with producing clarity on strategic direction and enhancing capacity simultaneously. So in the pre-mass Southern movement, we had a repertoire of contention that was operating that African Americans in the 20th century were using to struggle in various ways to try to attack Jim Crow in the North and South, but the big nut, of course, was the South. Nonviolent protests were long used in this battle, going back into the late 19th century and moving up into the 20th century. But they're small scale, they're scattered, and very disorganized. An additional strategy in this repertoire was institutionalized challenges, electoral politics in the North primarily, and of course, court legal strategies used by the NAACP, challenging lynching and so on. And third, there was, and this is another, I think, big neglect by sociologists that study the movement, is the neglect of armed self-defense. And there's a really interesting body of literature that's beginning to develop in this arena now. And so there's a commonality among all three of these strategies in the pre-mass movement, I'm talking pre-mid-50s. And that is, they're all relatively weak, they're isolated, small scale, they're episodic, they're outside the South, and they're basically lacking any kind of strategic development direction. So the strategy, the strategic development of mass nonviolent direct action American style, of the language that I'm using in this paper, basically consisted of a long, decades-long learning process, basically importing ideas, translating, experimenting with ideas from Gandhi. And this is, I have to give another nod to Sean's fine book on this strand. In this development, social movement schools are extremely important, crucial in this learning process. These are training centers, deliberately constructed training centers to dispense philosophy, strategy, tactics, methods, and so on, deeply instilled in the people who went through these movement school training centers. And then there are three big transformative moments to really kind of distill this long history. And I'd love to torture you with the narrative in the paper, but I'll just do it very, PowerPoint kind of way. Three big breakthrough moments led cumulatively to a sophisticated nonviolent repertoire that conceptualized and is practiced by some agents. This is what I'm calling the mass nonviolent direct action American style. So here are the three big moments. One is in the 40s, and this was the marriage, the merger, so to speak, between Philip Randolph coming out of the labor movement and basically developing what was called the March on Washington movement in the 1940s. Philip Randolph, coming out of the labor movement, was steeped in this idea that strategy for social change was hooked to numbers, masses, large numbers of people, basically coming out of a tradition of the general strike in the labor movement. Then there was this very, very interesting strand of Gandhians, Gandhian students, so to speak. Some of them were located, they were black religious intellectuals at places like Howard University, and then there were people for the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Congress of Racial Equality, people like A.J. Musty and James Farmer, Bayard Rustin, Pauli Murray. And here, what's really going on, I think that's important at this moment, is the conceptualization of quantity and quality coming together in the strategy. Not that it was put into action right away, not by any stretch of the imagination, but eventually it would be put into action in the South, and that came with the Montgomery bus boycott. What Montgomery did, and there's all kinds of literature on the Montgomery bus boycott, but for this story, my narrative, what is critical here is it demonstrated the potential power of this mass Gandhian approach. So the bus boycott showed that mass, direct, nonviolent action could possibly work in the South. This was a huge debate for decades. You know, even if you could conceive of translating this very disciplined, large number of collective action into motion somewhere, chances are it wouldn't work in the South. So this is a big deal when this happens in Montgomery. Then finally, 1960 is the real kind of turning point with the sit-in fever in spring '60. What happens at that point is the tactics become far more daring and directly confrontational. The sit-ins, think about it, the sit-ins are actually transgressions of local law and norms. It's not withholding your participation on riding the bus. Now you're going right into the white supremacist's face and defying them. So from that moment on, what we see in what Doug McAdam calls the heyday of the movement, 60 to 65, things heat up very, very quickly and they become very confrontational and violating of all kinds of norms in the South. So those are the three moments that I think are critical. And now that's the setup for going into tactical adaptation. I think what we've done too frequently, that is us scholars that study the civil rights movement, is we haven't thought seriously enough about where that strategic capability came from. We basically come at this problem by assuming tacitly that it could be no other way, that there were no other options, there were no other paths to social change. But what one of my slides was designed to do is to show you that this modal form of strategic action came out of a field that didn't go away when it became modal. Armed self-defense continued to be an important part of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, as did institutionalized tactics by the NAACP, as did aesthetic activism by people like Billie Holiday and Lorraine Hansberry and so on. These are artists that were using their art to advance the movement's goals. So by tactical adaptation, this is the second part of the paper, I'm talking about the ability of movement agents to creatively adapt when faced with violent repression from their opposition. And what I'm doing in this part is basically reversing a piece of what Doug McAdam did in an early ASR article in '83, where he was talking about the concept of tactical adaptation as the opposition to the movement's ability to undermine innovation, tactical innovation. So McAdam was talking about when the movement would shift from sit-ins to freedom rides, to community campaigns and so on. What that tended to do is increase the volume of activity for the movement. And tactical adaptation in his model was what the opposition, the white supremacist opposition, did to undermine that creativity. What I do is flip it around, and I think of tactical adaptation as the movement agent's ability to respond creatively to direct violence that comes at them. What do they do concretely when violence comes at them? What do they do? So the question, I think, is very important for scholars and activists, not the least of which, for reasons like nonviolent movements should expect to face violent repression. Chenoweth and Stefan's book cites evidence in their data that 88% of the movements that they studied in the 20th century face violent repression. And movement resilience in the face of violent assault is thought to be a major predictor of the likelihood of success. So for those reasons, this particular question I think is very important. So briefly, the kind of methodological strategy that I'm following in this part of the analysis is something that I call an episode sequence analysis within campaigns. So looking at an episode within, say, the sit-in phase of the movement, looking at episodes within the freedom rides, and then focusing on a major violent assault by the opposition on the movement, and then looking at what kind of responses the movement agents followed. So the cases, there's 5 major cases that I worked through in the paper. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them here, but there they are. And they span the years in the heyday of the movement, 60 to 65 for the most part. And limiting the time period to the heyday period gives me some kind of an approximate control for a variety of larger scale processes that could alter the outcomes of these adaptations, such as nonviolent repertoire development itself. I took you right up to the 60 point with that phase of the movement, political party, president, Cold War, federal government context, which mattered for these interactions. So my first case is the Nashville business desegregation movement in the spring of 1960. Some of the photos that I have are reasonably well known. I'm sure that a good number of you have seen them before. Basically, a little bit of background on this. What was going on in Nashville in the spring of 1960 was similar in certain ways with what was going on in a number of other southern cities. There was an attempt to desegregate a number of different institutions, and what the Nashville movement did, luckily for them, was that they really focused their attention on the business community. So they started out attacking Jim Crow color regulations in eating facilities within department stores and five and dime stores and so on, and then violating the code. And after a while, their sit-ins in these stores started to morph into jail-ins, in stand-ins, and so on. So we had multiple tactics spreading out through the city, and then they launched an economic boycott on the downtown businesses as well. In the midst of all this movement fervor, there was an attack on one of the leading black attorneys' houses with a bomb. That's what you see on the left-hand side. A large, very powerful bomb was thrown through the front window of their house, Z. Alexander Luby's house. And the explosion was so powerful that it blew out 140 windows of a medical building across the street. Across the street from where he lived was Meharry Medical School, which was the first African-American medical school in the United States, by the way. Immediately, what the core cadre that was trained by Jim Lawson did, they were scheduled to have a meeting at 6 o'clock that morning. The bomb was thrown through the window at 5:30 a.m. So they had a meeting already scheduled. And they quickly mobilized, organized for this, what they called the Silent March, a 2.5-mile march from Tennessee A&I campus, if you know Nashville, to the downtown courthouse where they were going to attempt to meet with the mayor of the city. So it was supposed to be a silent march, no talking, very disciplined, very deliberate, very serious, and then they confronted the mayor on the courthouse steps. Some of you have probably seen some video of this. There's actually some video that still survives, where some of the leaders, like people like John Lewis, Angela Butler, and Diane Nash in the front line of the march, actually confront the mayor, and they get him to basically come out and say that he thought segregation was immoral. And then they pushed him a little bit more and said, do you really think, if that's the case, that we should eliminate the segregation of eating facilities in the city? And he basically says yes, and the next day, front headlines on the newspapers in Nashville say, mayor says desegregate. So in a manner of speaking, this is a harnessing of violent events for moral suasion to produce basically what is called in some of the literature, backfire. So an attempt by the opposition to use direct violence, bombing, to intimidate and stop the movement actually works in the favor of the movement in this particular case. So I do something similar to what you see here on this screen for the Nashville movement for the other 4 cases that I mentioned as well. And if I have the time, maybe I can just show you a little bit more on the second case. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality launched their first Freedom Ride in May. And the idea was that they were going to test a recent Supreme Court decision, Boynton versus Virginia, that basically outlawed segregation in train and bus stations for interstate carriers. So the idea was to see if the government, the local authorities, would actually enforce this new decision. So they were going to ride from Washington, D.C. on 2 buses, integrated buses, from Washington, D.C. down to New Orleans. Well, they got down into the hardcore center of Alabama, and all hell broke loose. One of the buses was firebombed. That's the one you see here. The other one made it to Birmingham, where a white mob was waiting for them with baseball bats and chains and tire irons, and then beat the living hell out of them. At that point, the head of the Freedom Ride, the head organizer of the Freedom Ride, a guy named James Farmer, called off the rides. And this was music to the ears of the Kennedy administration because they were pleading with them not to do it anyway. So they call off the Freedom Rides after this violent attack. And so here's the tactical adaptation. A new wave of riders, within 3 days, the Nashville core cadre, people like Nash and Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, Jim Lawson, and so on, they take over. They pick up the baton. They go down into Montgomery and Birmingham. They take over the bus rides, and they keep the movement, the Freedom Ride movement, going. So that's a different kind of tactical adaptation. The outcome here from this adaptation was the Nashville core cadre, they continue to persist. The Freedom Rides continue. Over the course of 1961, there were 63 Freedom Rides launched during those months. Most of them were targeted at Jackson, Mississippi. I've been keeping an eye in these episode analyses, things like quantity and quality. In this case, there are 22 highly trained Nashville core cadre, and they were orchestrated by Diane Nash, who was the logistics person who stayed back in Nashville and regulated the operations for things like moving multiple waves of riders into Birmingham when Bull Connor would jail people or take them in vehicles and dump them out in the countryside hundreds of miles away. So what Diane did would come back with another round or wave of riders and send them down to Birmingham. So the lesson here from this particular episode is violence cannot be allowed to triumph over nonviolent campaigns. When the baton is dropped, someone has to pick it up. So this is one of the lessons that this core cadre learned from Jim Lawson in over about a year and a half of underground workshops in Nashville that put them in a position that was, I think, quite unusual, put them in a position where they were carrying an oppositional culture and knowledge of how to apply it that was far superior in many ways to many of the other participants in the movement. So a little bit of a summary. I got to short circuit the slides here. So some of the other campaigns that I didn't talk about, there was a Freedom Ride to Jackson that the Nashville cadre took over, and the kind of violence that they encountered there was immediate imprisonment. And then the violence took place behind prison walls. It wasn't out in public where the media could capture it, it was behind prison walls. So their adaptation to this confinement behind bars was basically to turn the prison into a social movement school. So there were other people from around the country that were getting on these freedom rides that they could interact with, and they could teach them what they had already learned in practice. And then when they were released from prison, and one of the prisons, by the way, that they were dumped into after they were in the holding pattern for a while in a regular jail, was the god-awful worst prison in the South during this time period called Parchment Penitentiary in Mississippi. Birmingham campaign was a tactical adaptation primarily to the failure in Albany. And then I think a fascinating part of the organizing, planning, and training of the Birmingham campaign that was done by some of the core cadre in Nashville was to train people in Birmingham in nonviolent strategies. Jim Lawson, James Bevel, and Diane Nash Bevel were the ones primarily responsible for that training. And they trained hundreds, thousands even, of very young students, not just college students, high school students, and elementary school students. Some of the youngest ones that they trained were 6 years old. And so their job was to discipline them, teach them enough about nonviolent tactics, to discipline them to go out in the streets in large numbers and absorb the attacks by Bull Connor's dogs and fire hoses and so on, and then get thrown in jail. The idea was to overload the jails and then bull counter would become even more violent. And part of the problem with, one of the reasons they went to the young children was they couldn't get enough adults to come out into the streets because they knew how darn dangerous it was, and they were worried about losing jobs and whatnot. In the Selma to Montgomery March, the campaign itself was a tactical adaptation to a murder of a voting rights protester in a small town outside of Selma called Marion. A guy named Jimmy Lee Jackson was gunned down by state troopers. And so in the midst of this murder, a host of local African Americans were talking about responding in kind. They're going to pick up the gun and go respond in kind. Enough of this nonviolent stuff. We're going to fight back with guns. And so this guy that I've been mentioning off and on, James Bevel, basically comes up with the idea that we've got to deflect that. We've got to absorb that anger and energy and channel it into a nonviolent strategy. And so he hatches this idea of the march from Selma to Montgomery. So these are all very different kinds of tactical adaptations with different kinds of lessons that are valuable not only for activists, but if thinking about bridging the literatures between nonviolent studies that has, I think, much more of a practical orientation to it, and literatures that we're familiar with in the sociology of social movements, these particular lessons become, I think, very valuable. On quantity and quality, just very quickly, the numbers, of course, of participants are extremely important. There's a certain kind of tactical dependency associated with numbers, like mass marches, by definition, need lots of people. Freedom rides, not so many, maybe, in the individual ride. But what you want in most of these tactics, I have learned from my time with Jim Lawson and studying some of these cases, what's really, really crucial is multiple waves. So even if the numbers are small in any particular round, multiple waves of activists doing the same thing, coming back at it as they are attacked by the opposition, are crucial. And then quality of insurgents are particularly crucial. In every one of these key cases, arguably the most important cases of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, the Nashville Core Cadre played a critical role. And in general, this is just a throwaway point, as an armed struggle, we should expect that quality of insurgent matters in nonviolent struggle as well. I mean, we wouldn't stop, we wouldn't hesitate 1 minute if someone said the quality of the training that SEAL team people receive is different from your regular Army recruit. It's like night and day. And so it is, I believe, with nonviolent insurgency. So several conclusions, and then I'll let someone else take over. So the nonviolent strategy and tactics became modal and relatively effective in the civil rights movement through a long historical process, and they continued to be a source of contention and debate throughout the movement. So this is not just something that everybody said, kumbaya, we're going to be nonviolent. It didn't happen that way. There was a lot of infighting that was kept under wraps fairly well during much of the movement, and then it started to come undone basically in '64 in the Freedom Summer Campaign, as well as in the Selma campaign. After '65, it was not the same as it was in the preceding 5 years. My project highlights strategic development of nonviolent oppositional praxis, and within it, tactical adaptation to violence, finding insurgent quality to be an important link between the two. Outcomes resulting from tactical adaptation to violence can assume forms other than backfire and failure, including the use of rescue and confinement, which can also be made to work for the movement. Defensive tactics are important. McAdam taught us that tactical innovation, that is changing forms of offensive tactics, could increase the pace of a movement. But my evidence suggests that defensive tactical adaptation to violence can also be a source of movement momentum and durability. So additional attention to nonviolent strategic development, insurgent quality, and tactical adaptation in other movements could have substantial payoff, I think, for further developing the bridge between social movement studies and nonviolent civil resistance studies. Thank you.